I was born Margaret Eleanor Collins in 1952 in the quiet lakeside community of Cedar Grove, Michigan. The town itself was unremarkable, a collection of modest homes, family-owned businesses, and church steeples that punctuated the skyline. But the surrounding landscape of crystalline lakes and ancient forests shaped my understanding of what truly mattered in life. My parents weren't wealthy by conventional standards, but they possessed a richness of character and vision that no bank account could measure. My father, Henry Collins, worked as a master carpenter at the Lakeland Furniture Factory, his skilled hands transforming raw lumber into pieces so finely crafted that some now sit in museums dedicated to American craftsmanship. My mother, Ruth, managed our household with the precise efficiency she had developed during her years as an executive secretary at the town's small law firm before marriage. Our red brick two-bedroom home on Maple Street was comfortable but unremarkable, except for what sat prominently on our dining table for as long as I could remember. It was a miniature wooden cabin, meticulously crafted by my father's hands during evenings after long days at the factory. Every detail was perfectly to scale. Tiny cedar shingles individually cut and placed on the roof, miniature windows with cross-hatched panes that caught the light, and a wraparound porch with railings so delicate it seemed impossible they were carved by human hands. "This isn't just a dream, Maggie," Dad would tell me as I carefully examined the model, memorizing every detail. His rough, calloused fingers would gently turn the structure to show me features hidden from immediate view. "This is our future. One day, we'll build this very house on Lakeview Point, and it will stay in our family for generations. When something matters enough, you plan for it, work for it, and sacrifice for it, not just for yourself, but for those who come after you." Lakeview Point was a rocky, steep promontory jutting into Lake Mitchell that most locals considered too challenging for building. The terrain dropped dramatically on three sides, and the soil was so dense with rocks that conventional foundations were nearly impossible to establish without expensive equipment. Where others saw obstacles, my father saw opportunity, a chance to create something lasting on land that few people valued, but that offered breathtaking vistas of water and sky changing through Michigan's dramatic seasons. When I was 12, after saving for nearly 15 years, my parents purchased 5 acres on the point for what seemed like a pittance, $4,800 for land nobody else wanted because conventional construction methods wouldn't work there. The bank manager had actually tried to talk them out of it, suggesting more sensible lots in new subdivisions being developed with identical ranch-style homes on flat, easily developed terrain. "We don't want sensible, Frank," my father had replied with the quiet confidence that characterized his approach to life. "We want meaningful. There's a difference." From the day we signed those papers, our family rhythm changed entirely. Every weekend without fail, through Michigan blizzards, spring downpours, and summer heat waves, our family would drive the 18 miles to that property in our aging Oldsmobile packed with tools, supplies, and thermoses of my mother's strong coffee. Initially, we focused on clearing brush, removing rocks, and studying how water moved across the property during heavy rains. My father believed in understanding the land before imposing any structure upon it. "Nature's been designing this plot for 10,000 years, Maggie," he would explain as we meticulously documented how snowmelt created temporary streams across certain sections. Only a fool would ignore her plans and force his own without consideration. By the time I entered high school, my friends spent weekends at the movie theater or local diner while I was mixing concrete, learning to read architectural drawings, or helping my father mill lumber from trees we selectively harvested from our own property. What might have felt like deprivation to another teenager became my education in values rarely taught in classrooms: patience, craftsmanship, and the profound satisfaction of creating something designed to outlast your own lifetime. "A house is more than wood and nails, Maggie," Dad would say as he taught me to dovetail joints or select the right wood grain for specific applications. "It's a physical manifestation of your values. Every choice, From how deep you dig the foundation to how carefully you finish the trim, speaks to what you believe about yourself and your responsibility to future generations. Quick work rarely lasts. Quick profits rarely satisfy. By my 20th birthday. The cabin was still nowhere near complete, but the foundation and frame stood solid against the Michigan winds, a testament to persistence over immediate gratification. The massive stone fireplace, with rocks we had personally gathered from the property and neighboring farmers' fields, formed the literal and metaphorical heart of the structure. Each stone had been carefully selected and placed by hand, creating a gradient of colors that mimicked the shoreline visible through the front windows. Unlike my friends, whose parents provided them with spending money for fashionable clothes and social activities, every spare dollar my family had went into building materials for the lake house. My parents drove cars until repairs exceeded their value, wore clothes until they couldn't be mended further, and took no vacations except to our own property. While some might have resented this sacrifice of immediate pleasures, I understood even then what my father was creating, not just a structure, but a legacy that embodied values increasingly rare in a world enamored with novelty and convenience. During my college years at Michigan State, studying business administration with a minor in architectural history, I would still return home on weekends to help with construction. My roommates couldn't understand why I'd trade campus parties for physical labor, but the slow, steady progress of the lake house taught me more about meaningful accomplishment than any textbook or lecture. It was during one of these weekends, in my junior year, that I met Robert Harrington. He was a young architect who had recently graduated from the University of Michigan and had been hired to design a home on a neighboring property, the first new construction attempt on Lakeview point since my father had begun his project. He'd stopped by, initially to ensure our work wouldn't interfere with his client's plans, but stayed for hours, fascinated by the unconventional building techniques my father was using to work with the challenging terrain. Robert wasn't what I expected from a University of Michigan architecture graduate. Instead of imposing theoretical concepts onto the landscape, he asked thoughtful questions about how my father had developed his approaches through careful observation of the site's natural features. Where others saw an old-fashioned man building a cabin the hard way, Robert recognized the ingenious adaptations and sustainable approaches that were decades ahead of their time. "Your father is a visionary," he told me as we walked the property. Line that evening, the setting sun turning Lake Mitchell into a sheet of hammered copper. These solutions for building on difficult terrain, architects are just starting to teach these concepts in graduate programs. He's developed them through pure observation and respect for the land. That evening marked the beginning of a relationship that would evolve through shared appreciation for thoughtful design and patient craftsmanship. Robert came from a well-established Detroit family with connections throughout Michigan's business and political communities. His father owned a successful commercial real estate development company, and his mother served on the boards of several cultural institutions in the state capital. They had provided him with every advantage: prestigious schools, European travel, social connections, but had also instilled a genuine appreciation for quality and integrity that transcended social class. Robert began visiting regularly, ostensibly to consult with my father on techniques for his client's property, but increasingly to spend time with me. Our courtship unfolded against the backdrop of the lake house's progression: conversations about life goals while sanding floorboards, discussions of family values while installing windows, and eventually, a proposal on the half-finished deck, overlooking the water at sunset. We married in 1976, and rather than purchasing a ready-made home in a fashionable neighborhood as his parents expected, Robert joined forces with my father to complete the lake house. His architectural training complemented my father's practical knowledge, allowing solutions to challenges that had previously seemed insurmountable. My mother and I focused on interior elements, designing built-in furniture that maximized the relatively modest square footage while maintaining the open feeling my father had envisioned. Over the next 5 years, the four of us transformed the rough frame into a stunning yet unpretentious home that seemed to grow naturally from its challenging site. The great room featured soaring windows that framed the lake view like a living painting that changed with the seasons. The kitchen, though compact, was designed with such efficiency that 3 people could cook together without collision. Bedrooms were deliberately small, but comfortable, encouraging family members to gather in shared spaces rather than retreat to private domains. "We're not just building a vacation home," Robert would echo my father's philosophy as we made crucial decisions about materials and design. "We're creating something that should outlast us by generations. Every decision needs to consider the long view." This perspective guided choices that sometimes confused visitors, like using more expensive quarter-sawn oak for flooring because it would wear more evenly over decades, or positioning the house to work with the natural landscape, rather than imposing upon it for a more impressive approach. We installed a geothermal heating system when most people had never heard of such technology, and designed passive cooling through strategic window placement and roof overhangs. The house took longer to complete and cost more upfront than conventional alternatives, but embodied values that transcended immediate convenience or fashion. My father would often remind us of the Swedish proverb he'd learned from his own grandfather. "A good house is built to last 100 years, a great one to last forever." Our son Michael was born in 1980, just as the main structure of the lake house was being completed. From his earliest days, he absorbed the rhythms of construction, falling asleep to the sound of sanding or the smell of cedar. By the time he could walk, he had his own tiny tool belt, helping his grandfather and father with increasingly complex tasks as he grew. As a toddler, he would solemnly hand nails to my father. By elementary school, he was learning to measure twice and cut once. In middle school, he helped install the custom bookshelves in what would become the library. His childhood summers and school breaks were defined by the lake house, fishing from the dock we built together, learning to swim in the clear waters below the property, and eventually helping to build the boathouse that would shelter the small sailboat Robert restored specifically for family adventures. "This will be yours someday, Michael," my father would tell him as they worked side by side. "Not just to own, but to care for. A house like this is a responsibility to maintain what others have created with love." These weren't just words for my son, they were lived experience. Michael witnessed firsthand how we prioritized quality over convenience, longevity over fashion, and family legacy over individual preference. When friends would visit and marvel at certain features of the house, Michael would proudly explain the thinking behind particular design choices or share stories about installing specific elements alongside 3 generations of his family. My father passed away in 1992, leaving the nearly completed lake house as his most tangible legacy. Robert and I finished the final details just as he would have wanted, with meticulous attention to craft and materials that honored his vision. The carved inscription over the front door, completed just weeks after his funeral, fulfilled his long-stated intention. Collins Harrington Lodge, Estor 1964, the year he first purchased the land, though construction began years later. The property deed listed both Robert and me as owners, but we always understood it wasn't merely our possession. We were stewards of something meant to connect generations. Michael continued spending summers and holidays at the lake house throughout, his youth and college years at the University of Michigan, where he studied finance. He brought friends who marveled at the craftsmanship and unique design that perfectly complemented its challenging site. When classmates shared stories of luxury vacations to tropical resorts or European capitals, Michael would describe stargazing from our dock or the family fishing tournaments that had become annual traditions. He seemed to absorb the values embedded in those walls: patience, quality, long-term thinking, and carried them into his own education and early career in corporate finance. The shift in Michael's relationship with the lake house began subtly, after he met Christine Peters during his MBA program at Northwestern. Christine came from a family whose wealth was substantial but relatively new. Her father had built a successful chain of high-end fitness centers across the Midwest, and her childhood had been defined by material comfort and social positioning. Where our family valued quality and longevity, Christine's priorities centered on appearance and impression. I first noticed the difference during their initial visit to the lake house as a couple. Where previous girlfriends had admired the handcrafted details and environmental design, Christine's comments focused on what could be updated or modernized. She praised the location and views effusively, but seemed to view the house itself as quaint rather than purposeful, a project to be improved rather than a legacy to be preserved. "The potential here is amazing," she said while walking through. The great room, her designer shoes incongruous against the hand-finished oak floors. With the right interior designer, this could be featured in a magazine. Robert, ever the diplomat, had simply smiled and mentioned how the house had been designed to frame the natural beauty outside rather than compete with it. I had been less successful at hiding my confusion at the suggestion that our decades of intentional creation constituted merely potential rather than fulfillment. Their wedding in 2005 was an elaborate affair at one of Chicago's most prestigious venues, quite different from the modest ceremony Robert and I had held on the deck of the lake house nearly 30 years earlier. The guest list included business connections and social acquaintances alongside family and close friends, and every detail had been coordinated by a professional wedding planner to create what Christine described as a cohesive aesthetic experience. A wedding gift, Robert and I added Michael's name to the lake house deed, officially making him co-owner of the property while retaining our own names as well. We presented the updated deed in a hand-carved box Robert had made from a maple tree that had fallen on the property during a storm the previous year, continuity and renewal embodied in a single gift. "This isn't just property passing to the next generation," Robert explained during a quiet moment at their reception, away from the photographers and orchestral ensemble. "It's the legacy of your grandfather's vision and craftsmanship. We're not giving you ownership so much as formally recognizing your role in continuing what he started." Michael seemed to understand at the time, nodding with appropriate solemnity at this passing of responsibility. Christine's response was polite, but less connected to the emotional significance. She thanked us for the generous gift, in terms that suggested she viewed it primarily as a financial asset rather than a physical embodiment of family values. Waterfront. "Property in Michigan is becoming such a smart investment," she noted while examining the deed. "Michael's financial background and my eye for design. We could really maximize its potential." The early years of their marriage included regular visits to the lake house, though Christine's enthusiasm always seemed connected to its utility for entertaining colleagues or impressing friends, rather than appreciating the craftsmanship or connecting with its history. She initiated a series of discussions about updates that prioritized contemporary aesthetics over the original design integrity, replacing the handcrafted oak kitchen cabinets with sleek imported models, or suggesting the stone fireplace might father had built by hand would look more current if covered with marble veneer. Robert, ever the diplomat, would gently redirect these suggestions with architectural explanations about design coherence and material integrity. I found it harder to mask my dismay at the thought of erasing my father's handiwork for the sake of transient trends. These different perspectives created undercurrents of tension beneath cordial family gatherings. Michael often positioned himself as mediator between these competing visions, acknowledging Christine's desire for a more contemporary aesthetic, while respecting the house's historical and emotional significance to his parents and late grandfather. This balancing act became increasingly difficult as their professional lives accelerated, with Michael advancing at his investment firm and Christine launching an interior design business catering to wealthy Chicago suburbanites. Their children arrived in succession, Emma in 2006 and Zachary in 2008, bringing new energy and purpose to family gatherings at the lake house. I took particular joy in watching my grandchildren discover the same natural wonders that had captivated Michael at their ages. Robert created child-sized furniture scaled perfectly for their proportions, continuing the tradition of building rather than buying whenever possible. When Robert passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack in 2015, the lake house became more than a vacation property to me. It was the physical embodiment of both my father's and husband's legacies, containing their craftsmanship, vision, and values in tangible form. Every corner held memories. The kitchen island where Robert had taught Michael to make his grandmother's bread recipe, the window seat where my father had read stories to his grandson, the deck railings whose spindles Robert had hand-turned on, a lathe he built himself. While grieving, I found comfort in the spaces they had created, feeling their presence in every carefully joined corner and thoughtfully designed space. I spent increasingly long stretches at the lake house rather than in our primary residence in Lansing, finding that the property's rhythms and memories provided healing that no grief counselor or support group could match. Michael and Christine's visits became less frequent after Robert's death, though their children, Emma and Zachary, then 9 and 7, continued expressing genuine love for the property and curiosity about its creation. When they did visit, I noticed increasing efforts by Christine to shape the narrative of the house in ways that diminished its handcrafted origins. "We're thinking of having an architect look at expanding the master suite," she mentioned during one visit, scrolling through design websites on her tablet. "Modern families really need more private space, and the primary bedroom is so small by today's standards." I attempted to explain how the modest bedroom dimensions had been intentional, encouraging family members to gather in shared spaces rather than retreat to private domains. But my perspective was increasingly treated as sentimental attachment, rather than purposeful design philosophy. I took particular joy in sharing stories about their great-grandfather and grandfather with Emma and Zachary during the moments when Christine was occupied with work calls or social media updates. We explored the house's special features designed specifically for children: the secret reading nook built into an eave, the growth chart carefully carved into a hidden door jamb that contained marks for 3 generations, or the series of animal figures my father had carved into discrete spots throughout the house as a perpetual scavenger hunt for young eyes. "Great-grandpa built this house so it would last for hundreds of years," I would tell them during these special moments, watching their eyes widen at the concept of time extending so far beyond their young perspectives. "That means someday it will be your responsibility to care for it and understand why it's special." These conversations happened during increasingly rare visits, and always when Christine was occupied elsewhere. Her vision for family vacations increasingly involved overseas travel or resorts that offered structured activities and social opportunities rather than the quiet reflection and family connection the lake house provided. When they did visit, it was often with additions: business associates Michael hoped to impress, Christine's clients interested in lakefront property, or families from their children's private school whose social connections aligned with their professional ambitions. The definitive shift in our family's relationship with the lake house occurred gradually, but reached its breaking point during a summer gathering in 2022. For the first time in several years, Michael had arranged for an extended family vacation at the property, 2 full weeks with no work interruptions, ostensibly to celebrate my 70th birthday and reconnect with the family legacy. I arrived at the lake house 3 days before Michael and his family were scheduled to join me, wanting time to prepare the property for what I hoped would be a meaningful family reunion. The early June weather cooperated beautifully. Warm days perfect for airing out bedrooms, and cool evenings ideal for enjoying the deck Robert had expanded during our 20th anniversary year. Those solitary days offered precious time to reacquaint myself with every corner of the home that contained so much of my family's history. I walked through each room, running my fingers along surfaces my father and husband had crafted, remembering the stories embedded in every feature. the cedar-lined closet where Michael had hidden during childhood games of hide-and-seek. The kitchen, island with the barely visible initials MC plus RH that we had discreetly carved into its underside the night before our wedding. The reading nook window where my father had taught me to identify different bird species that visited our feeders through changing seasons. With each passing hour spent in these familiar spaces, I felt increasingly centered and prepared for my family's arrival. Perhaps this extended visit would help Michael reconnect with the values embedded in these walls. Perhaps Emma and Zachary would develop deeper appreciation for their heritage. Perhaps even Christine might finally understand that the lake house wasn't simply an aging vacation property, but the physical embodiment of our family's defining values. I stocked the kitchen with ingredients for traditional family recipes, prepared welcome baskets for each bedroom with handcrafted items and personalized notes, and even restored the wooden sailboat that had provided 3 generations with adventures on Lake Mitchell. Everything was arranged to facilitate the kind of meaningful connection that had become increasingly rare during brief, activity-filled visits in recent years. When their SUV finally appeared on the winding driveway that my father had designed. To reveal the house and lake view at precisely the most dramatic moment, I felt genuine anticipation. Michael emerged first, looking both prosperous and tired in the way that successful mid-career professionals often do. Designer casual clothes that suggested carefully curated relaxation rather than actual ease. Christine exited the passenger side in an outfit more suited to a country club luncheon than a lake house arrival, her polished appearance contrasting with the natural setting in ways that still struck me as discordant even after nearly 2 decades of family gatherings. Emma and Zachary tumbled out with the enthusiastic energy of 16 and 14-year-olds finally freed from a long car ride, their attention immediately captured by the sailboat I'd positioned prominently on the lawn, freshly restored. "And ready for summer adventures, Grandma!" They called in near unison, rushing toward me with genuine warmth that momentarily dissolved my concerns about changing family dynamics. Their embraces felt like continuity, the physical connection between generations that the lake house itself was designed to foster. "You've restored Grandfather's boat," Emma observed with the perceptiveness that had always reminded me of Robert. "The last time we were here, it was covered in the boathouse." "I thought you might enjoy learning to sail this summer," I explained, pleased by her recognition of the boat's significance. "Your grandfather taught your father on this same vessel, and I think he'd be delighted to see the tradition continue." "Is it safe?" Christine interjected, before Emma could respond, eyeing the vintage wooden craft with visible skepticism. "Wooden boats require such specialized maintenance. We passed several places renting modern fiberglass boats with proper safety features on our drive up." This immediate redirection from heritage to convenience, from continuity to consumption, represented the subtle conflict that had characterized our relationship from its beginning. Where I saw meaningful connection to family tradition, Christine perceived outdated inefficiency. Where I valued the irreplaceable craftsmanship of objects, touched by generations, she prioritized the practical advantages of newer alternatives. "The boat's been thoroughly restored," I assured her with the patient tone I'd developed for such exchanges. "Robert designed it with multiple safety features that modern boats have only recently adopted. Michael can confirm it's perfectly sound. He practically lived on it during his teenage summers." Michael intervened with the diplomatic skill he'd developed as the bridge between our conflicting perspectives. "The boat looks great, Mom. Really thoughtful of you to restore it for the kids. Maybe we can all take turns teaching them this week." This suggestion of shared authority, positioning himself and Christine as equal partners in transmitting family traditions they hadn't created or previously valued, reflected the subtle renegotiation of family hierarchy that had accelerated following Robert's death. While never stated explicitly, there was increasing sense that my role as keeper of family heritage was being redefined as charming but unnecessary custodian of outdated customs rather than essential transmitter of foundational values. The first evening unfolded with superficial pleasantries despite these undercurrents. We shared dinner on the expansive deck overlooking the lake, with Michael proudly serving wine from a boutique California vineyard he'd recently invested in. The conversation remained carefully within boundaries unlikely to expose our different perspectives: the children's school accomplishments, Michael's recent promotion, Christine's expanding design business, and general observations about changes in the surrounding community since their last visit. Only when Zachary asked about the history of the massive stone fireplace did our divergent relationships with the property emerge more visibly. I began explaining how my father had gathered each stone personally from the property and neighboring fields, selecting them for both structural integrity and the subtle color gradient that mimicked the shoreline visible through the front windows. Our great-grandfather had never trained as a mason, I explained, warming to a story I'd shared with each generation. He studied historical building techniques from library books and consulted with an elderly stonemason in town before attempting such a complex project. It took nearly 3 years of weekends to complete, with your grandfather, my husband Robert, joining the effort after we met. That's such a sweet story, Christine interjected with the tone one might use when humoring a child's imaginative tale. Though I've always thought a more contemporary surround would better complement the clean lines we could develop with proper renovations. Natural stone has such a heavy aesthetic that limits design flexibility. The suggestion that my father's masterwork, the literal and metaphorical heart of the house, represented a limitation rather than achievement, momentarily silenced me. Michael, sensing tension, quickly redirected the conversation to safer territory, but the moment illuminated the fundamental disconnect that had been growing for years. For Christine, the lake house represented an unfinished canvas for creating the kind of showcase property that might appear in design magazines or impress business associates. For me, it embodied completed vision that deserved preservation rather than transformation. Each piece had been created with specific purpose that transcended aesthetic trends, a philosophy increasingly foreign in a world that valued novelty over continuity and impression over substance. Over the next several days, similar moments accumulated with increasing frequency. Christine arranged delivery of modern patio furniture without consultation, explaining that the handcrafted Adirondack chairs Robert had built were charming but uncomfortable for longer gatherings. She hired local cleaning service to properly deep clean before her college friends arrived for weekend visit, implying my careful maintenance had been insufficient. She rearranged kitchen organization systems that had been thoughtfully developed over decades of family use, prioritizing visual appeal over functional efficiency that reflected actual cooking patterns. Each change, while ostensibly practical, erased some element of the intentional design my father and husband had created. Each improvement subtly communicated that the original vision was somehow deficient rather than purposeful. Each conversation about these modifications positioned me as sentimental obstacle to progress rather than knowledgeable steward of meaningful legacy. Michael occupied increasingly uncomfortable middle ground, occasionally defending original features, when changes seemed particularly unnecessary, but more often diplomatically suggesting compromises that inevitably moved away from the house's original integrity. I recognized his difficult position, trying to honor both his wife's preferences and his family's heritage, but felt growing concern that essential values embedded in the property were being gradually eroded through these seemingly minor accommodations. The moments that gave me hope centered primarily around Emma and Zachary's genuine curiosity about the house and its history. Unlike their parents, they asked questions that reflected interest in why things had been designed certain ways, rather than how they might be updated or improved. They listened attentively to stories about features their great-grandfather and grandfather had created, seeming to grasp that the house represented something beyond property or investment. Is it true that great-grandpa tested the view from every window by building temporary frames on the site before actual construction began? Emma asked one afternoon as we walked the property perimeter, her architectural interest reminiscent of her grandfather. Absolutely true, I confirmed, delighted by her engagement with this detail I'd mentioned years earlier. He built wooden frames and positioned them at different heights and angles throughout the seasons before finalizing the house plans. He wanted to understand how light would enter each room during different times of day and year. That's way more thoughtful than how houses get built now, she observed with perception unusual for 16-year-old. Mom's design clients are always rushing their builders to finish quickly, even when things aren't quite right. These moments of connection with my grandchildren sustained me through increasingly evident tension with Christine, whose design ambitions for the property seemed to expand with each passing day. What had begun as suggestions for minor updates evolved into comprehensive vision for transformation that would effectively erase most elements of my father's and husband's craftsmanship in favor of contemporary aesthetic more aligned with her professional portfolio. The situation reached critical inflection point midway through our 2-week gathering, when Christine's college friends arrived for weekend visit that significantly altered the property's atmosphere. These 4 couples, all professionally successful and socially polished, brought energy more appropriate for luxury resort than family retreat. Their presence transformed quiet evenings of conversation into elaborate cocktail hours, replaced simple meals with catered affairs requiring rental equipment, and shifted focus from the natural landscape to social dynamics more typical of their urban environments. I made genuine effort to accommodate this different approach to property I had always experienced as place for meaningful connection rather than entertainment venue. I shared stories about the house's creation when asked, assisted with meal preparations despite unfamiliar menu choices, and retreated to my bedroom when late-night conversations turned toward business networking or social gossip that held little interest for me. The most revealing moment of this weekend gathering occurred during Christine's guided tour of the property for her friends, which I overheard while retrieving book from the library. Her narration positioned the house as charming family cabin we're gradually updating, rather than carefully crafted legacy designed to embody specific values. She referred to my father's masterful stonework as rustic original feature we're working around, and described Robert's hand-built cabinetry as vintage elements adding character until we renovate. This reframing, transforming purposeful craftsmanship into quaint artifacts temporarily tolerated until proper modernization could occur, felt like fundamental betrayal of everything the property represented. The lake house wasn't awaiting improvement or updating to reach its potential. It had been thoughtfully completed according to specific vision that balanced aesthetic beauty with functional purpose and environmental harmony. Treating this vision as preliminary sketch rather than accomplished achievement dishonored both the creators and the values their work embodied. I said nothing in that moment, recognizing that confrontation during social gathering would only create unnecessary tension. But the experience crystallized growing awareness that Christine, and increasingly Michael, viewed the property through fundamentally different lens than the one that had guided its creation. Where my father and husband had built physical manifestation of values meant to endure across generations, they saw asset to be optimized for contemporary preferences and social positioning. By Sunday evening, after Christine's friends had departed with effusive praise for the amazing potential of the property, I found myself emotionally exhausted by the effort of maintaining pleasant facade while witnessing what felt like systematic undermining of my family's legacy. I retreated to the dock as sunset approached, seeking solace in the natural beauty that had originally inspired my father's vision for this special place. I was sitting on the dock's edge, feet dangling above water that reflected deepening hues of pink and gold, when Michael joined me. Without preamble, he settled beside me with the comfortable familiarity that reminded me of countless sunset conversations throughout his childhood and young adulthood. For several minutes, we sat in companionable silence, watching the sun's gradual descent behind distant tree line across the lake. "I know this visit hasn't been exactly what you hoped for," he finally said. his tone suggesting genuine recognition of the tension beneath our carefully maintained cordiality. "Christine has a different vision for the property than Dad and Grandpa did." "Different isn't necessarily wrong," I offered, trying to acknowledge legitimate diversity of perspective while still protecting what mattered most. "But this house wasn't built to follow trends or impress visitors. Every element was created with purpose that goes beyond appearance." "I understand that," Michael replied, though his tone suggested incomplete grasp of what I was truly expressing. "But properties need updating over time. What worked for previous generations might not serve the same purpose for current users." This framing previous generations and current users rather than family and legacy revealed how fundamentally our perspectives had diverged. Michael had subtly adopted framework that positioned the lake house as functional asset rather than embodiment of values, as property rather than legacy. The distinction might seem semantic to outsiders, but represented essential difference in how we understood the house's significance and purpose. "The purpose hasn't changed, Michael," I said quietly, watching last light illuminate ripples where fish were beginning their evening feeding. "This place was created to connect generations through shared values, not to follow whatever design. Trends are currently fashionable. Your grandfather built this deck specifically because sunset conversations like this one were central to how he understood family connection." Michael was silent for a moment, and I hoped my words had penetrated the practical, asset-oriented mindset that seemed to have overtaken his earlier understanding of the property's significance. When he finally spoke, however, his response revealed how completely the perspective I'd tried to instill had been replaced by different framing. "I respect what Dad and Grandpa created," he said in tone that suggested announcement preceding contradiction. "But Christine and I have been talking about long-term plans that would make more sense for how our family actually uses vacation properties. We're thinking about subdividing the 5 acres into 3 parcels, keeping the main house area but developing the other sections with modern lake homes we could either sell or rent as income properties." The suggestion struck me with physical force that momentarily took my breath away. Not only did it reveal complete abandonment of the property's intended purpose as single, integrated environment designed to work harmoniously with natural landscape, but it reduced my father's carefully selected land to financial opportunity rather than meaningful legacy. The entire property, from the rocky shoreline to the mature forest that provided both privacy and wildlife habitat, had been chosen and developed as cohesive whole, not as potential real estate development. "Your grandfather purchased this specific property because it couldn't be conventionally developed," I reminded him, working to keep emotion from overwhelming my voice. "He specifically wanted land that developers wouldn't find appealing because he intended it to remain unified and protected from exactly the kind of division you're suggesting." "That was different time with different real estate values," Michael countered with professional confidence that further distanced him from the values I thought he had absorbed. "The lakefront property market has completely transformed since Grandpa made his purchase. What might have seemed impractical for development then represents significant opportunity now with modern construction techniques." The conversation continued with increasing distance between our perspectives. Michael outlined potential financial benefits of subdivision and development with the detached analysis of the investment banker he had become. I attempted to articulate the intangible values that such development would inevitably compromise. We spoke the same language in technical sense, but occupied fundamentally different moral universes regarding the property's purpose and significance. As darkness finally enveloped the lake, we returned to the house without resolution. The gulf between our understandings seemingly unbridgeable. I retired early that evening, emotionally drained by realization that what I had understood as shared family legacy had been reframed as financial asset awaiting optimization. The property deed might include Michael's name alongside mine, but the values I had assumed would guide its stewardship appeared increasingly absent from his calculations. The following days brought superficial return to pleasant family interactions, though undercurrent of unresolved tension remained palpable beneath cordial conversations. Christine continued suggesting modifications that would fundamentally alter the house's character, while positioning these changes as necessary updates, rather than transformative reimagining. Michael focused increasingly on practical aspects of property maintenance, discussing costs and contractors in ways that framed the house primarily as physical asset requiring management, rather than embodiment of values deserving protection. Only with Emma and Zachary did I find moments of genuine connection to the lake house's intended purpose. We spent morning navigating the restored wooden sailboat across Lake Mitchell, continuing the tradition Robert had established with Michael decades earlier. We explored the property's walking trails, identifying bird species my father had documented in journal he maintained throughout the construction process. We even spent rainy afternoon learning traditional wood joining techniques in the small workshop, where so many of the house's distinctive features had been created. These brief interludes renewed my hope that essential transmission might skip generation, that my grandchildren might eventually grasp what their parents had seemingly forgotten about the property's true significance. Yet these moments remained effectively quarantined from the property's emerging identity under Christine's influence, treated as quaint activities with grandmother rather than meaningful connection to legacy that should shape their understanding of the place itself. As my birthday approached, ostensibly the reason for this extended family gathering, I noticed increasing secrecy suggesting surprise celebration was being planned. Brief conversations would halt when I entered rooms. Lists were quickly tucked into pockets when I approached. Deliveries arrived while I was conveniently engaged elsewhere on the property. Under normal circumstances, these preparations would have touched me as thoughtful acknowledgement of milestone birthday. Given the growing tension regarding the property's identity and future, however, they generated more apprehension than anticipation. My concerns proved warranted when 2 days before my actual birthday, elaborate celebration unfolded that exemplified the fundamental disconnect between my understanding of the lake house and what it had become under Christine's influence. The deck that Robert had designed for family gatherings had been transformed with rented furniture, professional lighting, and decorative elements that could have been transplanted directly from upscale Chicago restaurant. The simple, functional outdoor kitchen where we had prepared countless family meals had been temporarily supplemented with catering equipment staffed by uniformed servers. Even the carefully maintained natural landscape had been augmented with potted topiary and flower arrangements more appropriate for formal garden than woodland setting. Most disconcerting was guest list that extended well beyond family to include business associates, Christine's clients, and social connections whose relationship to me was tangential at best. What might have been intimate celebration of family milestone had been expanded into networking opportunity and social showcase that positioned the lake house as impressive venue rather than meaningful home. I maintained pleasant demeanor throughout the event, accepting birthday wishes from people whose names I struggled to remember, and whose connection to me seemed primarily through professional relationships with Michael or Christine. I expressed appropriate appreciation for elaborate catering that bore no relationship to family recipes that had traditionally marked celebrations at the lake house. I even managed genuine gratitude for Michael's toast that, while affectionate, emphasized practical contributions I had made to family's material success rather than values I had attempted to transmit. The emotional distance between this celebration and what would have felt truly meaningful did not escape Emma's notice. As servers cleared dessert plates and professional photographer Christine had hired began organizing guests for what she called the formal portraits, my granddaughter joined me at quiet corner of the deck. "This doesn't feel like you, Grandma," she observed with perceptiveness that momentarily caught me off guard. "I remember your other birthdays here being much simpler." "Different isn't necessarily wrong," I repeated the diplomatic phrase I'd been using throughout the visit, touched by her recognition but unwilling to criticize her parents' choices directly. "But it should still feel authentic," she persisted with wisdom beyond her 16 years. "This feels like Mom's design portfolio come to life, not like the lake house I remember from when I was little. Before I could respond to this remarkably astute observation, Christine's voice cut through the ambient conversation, calling for everyone's attention. She stood near the deck railing with professional photographer, golden hour sunlight creating perfect backdrop across the lake that seemed almost too perfectly orchestrated. "Before we lose this gorgeous light," she announced with the polished authority she brought to all social situations, "we'd like to capture the perfect family portrait to commemorate Margaret's special birthday and our wonderful summer together at the lake house. Could the Harrington family please gather by the railing?" As guests stepped aside to create path, Michael guided Emma and Zachary toward designated spot with practiced ease that suggested previous coordination. Christine joined them, arranging herself and family members with designer's eye for composition against the spectacular sunset backdrop. They stood framed against my father's carefully selected view. The craftsmanship of the deck railing Robert had hand-carved barely visible beneath elaborate floral arrangements Christine had positioned at strategic intervals. I moved to join them, naturally assuming that the Harrington family included me as the actual Harrington by birth and marriage, when Christine's voice stopped me with practiced smoothness that barely disguised its underlying dismissal. "We're going for a more immediate family look this year, Margaret. Perhaps you could take the photo instead." Her tight smile never reached her eyes as she positioned everyone on the deck of the lake house my late husband and I had built with our own hands. The request, delivered with such casual authority that many guests likely perceived nothing unusual, crystallized everything that had been happening beneath the surface throughout our extended visit. I wasn't being positioned as family matriarch whose birthday provided occasion for gathering, but as peripheral figure whose proper role was documenting rather than participating in family's central narrative. The property my father had envisioned, my husband had helped create, and I had helped build with my own hands over decades, was being recast as backdrop for family that, in Christine's carefully curated presentation, consisted only of herself, Michael, and their children. My role as essential connection to the property's purpose and history had been effectively erased, replaced by functional assignment as photographer documenting moment from which I had been deliberately excluded. I stood there, camera suddenly, heavy in my hands, watching as they posed against the backdrop of the sunset over waters where 3 generations of my family had learned to swim. The physical weight of the camera was nothing compared to emotional weight of recognition washing over me in that moment. This wasn't simple oversight or thoughtless request. It was culmination of years of subtle repositioning that had gradually transformed my understanding of the lake house from what Christine now presented as reality. With mechanical politeness driven by decades of social conditioning rather than genuine acceptance, I raised the camera and captured the image Christine had choreographed. The technical results were undeniably beautiful. Golden light illuminating 4 perfectly arranged figures against spectacular natural backdrop, everyone smiling with practiced ease that appeared genuine until you noticed the emptiness behind their eyes. Throughout remainder of the evening, as guests gradually departed with effusive thanks for a wonderful celebration, I maintained composed exterior that revealed nothing of the fundamental shift occurring within me. I participated in conversations, thanked caterers, and even helped direct cleanup efforts with the practical efficiency that had characterized my approach to household management throughout my life. Inside, however, decisive clarity was forming. Around realization that had been building throughout our 2-week gathering, the lake house, physical embodiment of my family's defining values and legacy, was being systematically transformed into something that contradicted its essential purpose. The property created to connect generations through shared understanding was being repurposed as status symbol and potential investment opportunity. My role as steward of its meaning had been reduced to sentimental attachment, easily dismissed when inconvenient to newer, more relevant vision. That evening, while laughter still echoed from the great room where Michael, Christine, and remaining guests enjoyed after-dinner drinks, I quietly retreated to my bedroom and removed the original property deed from the fireproof box I always traveled with. The document, showing property ownership shared between myself, Robert, whose portion had never been legally transferred after his death, and Michael, represented not just legal reality that contradicted Christine's carefully curated narrative, but physical evidence of values that transcended current reimagining. With same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized my approach to the lake house's creation and maintenance, I placed the deed on the kitchen table where breakfast would be served the following morning. I positioned it carefully beside the decorative centerpiece Christine had arranged. Original document with my father's name still visible as original purchaser, creating stark contrast to artificial flowers imported for occasion rather than gathered from property as had been our family's tradition. I then returned to my room and packed essentials for departure, while household gradually quieted as remaining guests left and family retired for the night. Unlike dramatic exits portrayed in films, my preparations were practical and thorough, organizing necessary items while leaving personal effects that could be retrieved later, under less emotionally charged circumstances. The decisive action, forming in my mind, required clarity rather than reactive emotion, purpose rather than mere protest. As moonlight filtered through windows my father had positioned to capture both sunrise and moonrise throughout changing seasons, I completed preparations, with calm certainty that would have surprised those who might have expected emotional breakdown more typical of cinematic confrontations. The lake house had taught me patience and purposeful action over impulsive reaction. The values embedded in its creation would guide my response to its potential destruction. I slept surprisingly soundly that night. Decision crystallized, bringing clarity that had been absent during weeks of navigating increasingly uncomfortable disconnection. Morning would bring inevitable confrontation, but foundation for that conversation had been laid through document placed where it could not be ignored. Legal reality would provide starting point for discussion about deeper truths regarding properties, purpose, and proper stewardship. That evening, while they laughed over dinner, I quietly retrieved the property deed from my suitcase and placed it beside their breakfast plates. 6 months later, I sat across from my son at our family attorney's office, tears in his eyes as he finally understood that some inheritances aren't measured in square footage, but in the memories woven into every floorboard and window pane. Awoke early the following morning, my internal clock still attuned to the rhythms established over decades of lake house summers. The soft golden light filtering through east-facing windows, positioned precisely to capture dawn's first illumination, created the gentle awakening my father had intentionally designed into the bedroom architecture. For several moments I remained still, absorbing the familiar sounds of the house settling and lake water lapping against the shoreline 30 yards away. This mindful awakening had been part of my lake house routine since childhood, but today, it carried additional significance. The deed I had placed on the kitchen table the previous evening would now be delivering its message, revealing legal reality that contradicted the narrative Christine had been carefully constructing. My calm certainty about this necessary step remained intact, though I harbored no illusions about the conversation that would inevitably follow. I dressed with deliberate care in clothing that my husband had always particularly appreciated. A simple linen shirt in deep blue that matched the lake's midday hue, and comfortable khaki pants suitable for the property's natural setting. This wasn't conscious strategy so much as intuitive alignment with the authentic identity I was reasserting. Practical steward of meaningful legacy rather than peripheral figure in someone else's reimagining. When I finally emerged from my bedroom and made my way toward the kitchen, the house's unusual silence immediately registered. Normally by 8 o'clock, especially with guests, the great room and kitchen would be filled with conversation, breakfast preparations, and the general energy of multiple people beginning their day. Today, despite the late night, an unnatural stillness suggested something had disrupted normal patterns. The kitchen revealed the likely explanation. The property deed remained exactly where I had placed it, but now surrounded by empty coffee cups, suggesting extended conversation had already occurred. the untouched breakfast ingredients I had prepared the previous evening. Locally sourced eggs, heirloom tomatoes from the garden plot my father had established 50 years earlier, and bread dough rising in the ceramic bowl Robert had commissioned. From a local potter, stood in silent testimony to disrupted routine. From the partially open door to Robert's study, a room Christine had recently been referring to as the future media room in her renovation discussions, I heard Michael's voice, uncharacteristically tense, and Christine's responses, pitched lower than her normal confident tone, but with unmistakable intensity that suggested significant disagreement. Rather than interrupt what was clearly a private conversation prompted by my silent message, I prepared a single cup of coffee and took it to the dock, the place where my most important conversations with my father, husband, and son had unfolded over decades. The morning sunlight transformed the lake's surface into rippling silver, fish occasionally breaking the mirror-like quality with concentric rings that expanded and dissolved in rhythmic continuity that seemed particularly appropriate to this moment of familial reckoning. I had been sitting there nearly 30 minutes when I heard footsteps on the wooden planking. The distinctive pattern, careful, measured, slightly hesitant, identified Michael before he came into view. He had inherited his father's deliberate gait, though lacking the easy confidence that had characterized Robert's relationship with the physical world. Michael's movements had always suggested someone thinking several steps ahead rather than fully present in the current moment, appropriate metaphor for differences in how we approached the lake house itself. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, the formality in his tone confirming that our relationship had entered new territory, requiring renegotiation of previously assumed connections. I gestured to the adjacent Adirondack chair, one of a matched pair. Robert had crafted for our 25th anniversary, the wood harvested from a lightning-struck oak on the property that he had carefully milled and aged for 3 years before beginning construction. Michael settled into it with visible discomfort that seemed unrelated to the chair's physical properties. For several minutes, we sat in silence that contrasted sharply with the easy conversations this spot had hosted throughout his childhood and early adulthood. The weight of unspoken recognitions and competing perspectives created barrier that simple words seemed initially inadequate to penetrate. "You've never mentioned that Dad's name is still on the deed," Michael finally said, his tone suggesting this previously unknown fact represented some form of deliberate withholding rather than simply unexamined detail in our family arrangements. "It never seemed relevant to mention," I replied with genuine rather than strategic honesty. "Legal ownership has never been the point of this place. Your father and I added your name to the deed as recognition of continuity, not as financial transaction or transfer of control. The document simply reflected our family's understanding of shared stewardship. But as it stands legally, I only own 1/3 of the property," he continued, the investment banker's perspective eclipsing the son's connection to family legacy. "Dad's portion would pass through probate, and technically, you control 2/3 of the ownership." This focus on proportional control rather than shared purpose illuminated how completely our perspectives had diverged. Where I understood the property as physical embodiment of values that transcended legal ownership, Michael had adopted framework that reduced it to asset with distributed legal claims, technical reality without spiritual substance. The percentages, on paper, have never guided any decision about this place, I reminded him gently. Every modification, from the deck extension your father designed to the reading nook we created for your children, has been discussed as family matter guided by the property's purpose, not by legal authority or ownership shares. Michael shifted uncomfortably, suggesting recognition of truth he found inconvenient to current perspective. "Things change, Mom. Family circumstances evolve. What worked as informal arrangement when Dad was alive, and when Christine and I were just married doesn't necessarily serve current realities." "Which realities would those be?" I asked, genuine curiosity beneath question that might otherwise have seemed confrontational. Has something fundamental changed about why this place exists and what it was intended to represent? This direct inquiry regarding purpose rather than procedure momentarily silenced him. Beyond technical considerations of legal ownership or financial potential lay the essential question neither he nor Christine had directly addressed throughout their gradual reframing of the property's identity. What was the lake house for, and how should that purpose guide decisions about its future? "We have different ideas about the best use of the property," he finally offered. Professional diplomacy creating distance from personal responsibility for perspective that contradicted the values he had been raised to embody. "Christine has vision for updates that would enhance both our enjoyment and the property's long-term value. I'm not concerned about different ideas for decoration or modern conveniences," I clarified, wanting to distinguish between superficial preferences and fundamental purposes. "I'm asking about the property's essential purpose. Your grandfather didn't build showcase for impressing business associates or investment vehicle for potential subdivision. He created physical embodiment of specific values meant to connect generations through shared understanding of what matters beyond financial success or social positioning." Michael's gaze remained fixed on the lake rather than meeting mine, body language suggesting discomfort with direct examination of values, conflict underlying our more visible disagreements about physical modifications or social utilization of the property. "Those values were formed in different era," he said after extended silence, words chosen with careful precision that revealed awareness of territory being contested. "The economic and social context has transformed dramatically since Grandpa purchased this land. What represented wise stewardship then might not align with responsible asset management now." This framing, asset management rather than legacy, preservation, confirmed transformation in perspective I had been observing with increasing concern. The lake house had been reconceptualized from living embodiment of families defining values into financial holding, requiring optimization according to contemporary economic principles, with no reference to original purpose or meaning. "Your grandfather understood economic value perfectly well," I noted, unwilling to allow characterization of my father's choices as somehow naive or uninformed. "He chose this property precisely because it represented commitment to values that transcend market fluctuations or investment returns. He could have purchased conventional lot with easier construction parameters and better financial growth potential. He specifically selected challenging site requiring unconventional approaches because it embodied the principle that meaningful achievement requires effort aligned with purpose beyond financial gain." For the first time since joining me, Michael turned to make direct eye contact, momentary reconnection to authentic communication we had once shared regularly in this exact spot. Something in my words had penetrated the professional persona he had increasingly adopted in family interactions, reaching the young man who had learned to sail, build furniture, and value craftsmanship under his grandfather's and father's patient guidance. "I remember him saying something similar when I was young," he acknowledged, brief vulnerability in expression suggesting memories not entirely extinguished by years of corporate recalibration. "Something about the difference between price and value. Price is what you pay, value is what you create," I quoted, recognizing my father's distinctive phrasing that had guided so many family discussions about meaningful choices. He wasn't talking about financial investments, but life investments, where you direct your time, attention, and effort based on what truly matters rather than what merely costs or returns money. This reference to principle that had once been central to our family's shared understanding created noticeable shift in conversational energy. For a brief moment, Michael seemed to reconnect with perspective that had shaped his childhood and early adulthood before professional immersion in financial metrics, and Christine's status-oriented worldview had gradually transformed his relationship with the lake house legacy. Before this potential opening could develop further, however, the sound of approaching footsteps announced another presence, the distinctive click of hard-soled shoes against wooden planking immediately identifying Christine's arrival. Unlike family members who typically adopted footwear appropriate to the property's natural setting, she maintained urban aesthetic regardless of practical considerations, another small but telling indicator of values disconnect that had been widening for years. "There you are," she said as she approached, tone suggesting Michael had deviated from agreed-upon approach rather than engaged in necessary conversation with his mother. "I've been looking everywhere. The caterers need direction about retrieving their equipment." This immediate redirection to logistical concerns, prioritizing service providers over family conversation at pivotal moment, exemplified the fundamental differences in how we perceive the property and its purpose. Where I saw essential venue for meaningful connection during critical family transition, Christine saw event location requiring management according to external schedules and obligations. "I'll be there shortly," Michael responded with subtle, return to professional demeanor that had momentarily softened during our conversation. "Mom and I were discussing the property deed." Christine's expression registered immediate recognition of topic's significance, her carefully maintained composure showing microfractures that revealed awareness of how documentary evidence undermined narrative she had been constructing about the lake house and family hierarchy surrounding it. "We should probably discuss that as a family," she suggested with practiced smoothness that nevertheless conveyed unmistakable message that current conversation should not continue without her presence and input. "Perhaps after the caterers have departed and we've had chance to properly review the documentation with appropriate professional consideration." The phrasing, appropriate professional consideration rather than family discussion, further illuminated how completely different frameworks we were applying to situation. Where I understood the deed as symbol of values requiring personal reckoning and realignment, Christine interpreted it as technical document requiring professional analysis and strategic response. "I'm not interested in legal maneuvering or ownership negotiations," I clarified, wanting to redirect focus from procedural details to essential purpose. "I simply felt it was important to establish accurate understanding of the property's history and intended legacy at moment when those elements seemed increasingly absent from current conversations about its future." Christine's expression suggested both recognition of implied criticism and immediate calculation of various potential responses, professional training in client management temporarily visible beneath practiced social mask. After brief but noticeable pause, she opted for conciliatory approach that nevertheless maintained underlying positioning. "We all value your perspective on the property's history," she offered with diplomat skill in acknowledging without actually conceding anything. "Your connection to the original vision provides context that should certainly inform thoughtful evolution for current family needs and long-term appreciation potential." This framing, positioning me as historical consultant rather than essential authority on property's purpose, represented subtle continuation of narrative that had been developing throughout our extended visit. My role was being carefully redefined as provider of optional background information, rather than steward of foundational values that should guide any modifications or future planning. As conversation continued with increasing participation from Christine, what had begun as potentially meaningful reconnection between mother and son transformed into carefully managed negotiation with proportional ownership and decision-making authority as primary considerations. The discussion shifted from why the house existed and what values it represented to who controlled what percentage of legal ownership and how those technicalities should influence renovation decisions and potential development plans. Throughout this evolving conversation, I maintained calm presence that neither escalated tension nor surrendered essential principle at stake. The deed had accomplished its immediate purpose, disrupting assumption of unilateral authority that had been developing in my absence and establishing factual correction to narrative Christine had been constructing. The deeper work of reconnecting Michael to values embedded in the property would clearly require more than single conversation or documentary evidence. I think we should continue this discussion after you've had opportunity to consult with whomever you feel necessary, I finally suggested as conversation circled increasingly technical considerations without addressing fundamental purpose. The deed simply establishes actual rather than assumed legal reality. The more important conversation involves what this property means and how that meaning should guide its future. This redirection from legal details to essential purpose visibly discomfited Christine, whose professional expertise and personal comfort centered on practical arrangements rather than philosophical foundations. Michael's expression suggested internal conflict between frameworks. The values-centered understanding he had been raised with competing against market-oriented analysis that had increasingly shaped his professional identity, and, through Christine's influence, his personal perspectives as well. "We should probably help with the caterers now," Christine suggested, relief at potential transition to more comfortable practical territory evident in her tone and posture. "We can revisit the ownership discussion once things have settled and everyone has had opportunity for proper consideration." As they departed the dock together, their body language revealed subtle but significant shift in dynamic from previous day. Michael slightly more physically distant from Christine than typical couple pattern, Christine's normally confident stride, showing marginally increased tension, suggesting recognition that established narrative had been effectively challenged by simple documentary evidence. I remained at the dock for extended period following their departure, watching sunlight strengthen across the lake's surface while contemplating next steps in necessary recalibration of family understanding. The deed itself was merely starting point for deeper conversation about values and legacy that transcended legal technicalities. The essential question remained unanswered. What was the lake house for, and how should that purpose guide decisions about its future? When I finally returned to the house, the atmosphere had transformed noticeably. The cleaning crew Christine had hired was efficiently removing all evidence of previous evening's celebration, erasing imported decorations and rented furniture that had temporarily transformed the property from family home to social venue. Michael was engaged in detailed conversation with catering manager regarding equipment retrieval, while Christine was nowhere immediately visible. I proceeded to kitchen where Emma and Zachary were preparing simple breakfast using ingredients I had set out the previous evening. Quiet domestic activity providing stark contrast to elaborate catered affair that had characterized recent meals. Their relaxed interaction and unself-conscious use of the space suggested temporary absence of the performance-oriented atmosphere that had permeated the house during extended family gathering. "Morning, Grandma." Zachary greeted me with genuine warmth that transcended tensions circulating among adult family members. "We're making Grandpa's famous blueberry pancakes from the recipe card in your wooden box. Hope that's okay." This simple act, accessing family recipe preserved in box Robert had crafted rather than following trendy cooking technique or restaurant-inspired presentation, represented subtle but meaningful connection to traditions Christine had been systematically replacing with contemporary alternatives. The recipe cards, handwritten by various family members across 3 generations, embodied exactly the kind of intangible legacy the house itself had been designed to preserve and transmit. "It's more than okay," I assured him, emotion momentarily tightening my throat at this unexpected evidence that essential transmission had occurred despite systematic reframing of the property's meaning. "It's exactly right." Emma looked up from where she was carefully measuring ingredients with the precision my father had always insisted represented respect for both the process and those who would enjoy its results. "Mom and Dad seem weird this morning," she observed with typical directness. "Something about property paperwork. Are they trying to sell the lake house?" The question, unfiltered by adult diplomatic constraints, cut directly to anxiety that likely underlaid their reaction, to discovering actual ownership distribution. The possibility of unilateral decisions regarding property's future had been significantly complicated by revelation that Michael's legal authority extended to only 1/3 rather than presumed entirety. "Not exactly," I answered carefully, respecting their right to understanding while avoiding unnecessary exposure to adult tensions. "We're having important conversation about the lake house's purpose and future." Your great-grandfather built it for specific reasons that sometimes get forgotten when people focus only on how it might be updated or changed. Like how Mom wants to knock out the library wall to make bigger entertainment space. Zachary asked with surprising awareness of renovation discussions I hadn't realized had progressed to specific structural modifications. Dad said that would mess up the roof support system Grandpa designed. This casual revelation, that Michael had actually opposed structural change based on respect for Robert's engineering rather than simply aesthetic preference, suggested important nuance in his position. Despite external evidence of alignment with Christine's transformation agenda, he apparently maintained some recognition of the property's architectural integrity and purposeful design that might serve as foundation for reconnection to its deeper significance. The house was designed as integrated whole where each element serves specific purpose connected to family values, I explained, recognizing teachable moment with generation that would eventually become property's stewards. Changes might seem individually reasonable, but cumulatively transform the home's essential character and purpose if they're not guided by understanding of why it was created in first place. Emma nodded with surprising comprehension for 16-year-old typically focused on teenage priorities. Like how great-grandpa positioned the windows to track the sun differently in each season. Mom thinks they're inefficient because they're different sizes, but you explained they were specifically designed that way to connect us to natural patterns. This demonstration of attentive listening and genuine understanding regarding design elements I had explained years earlier, apparently absorbed despite being largely dismissed by her parents, provided unexpected evidence that essential transmission had occurred through direct connection between first and third generations. My conversations with Emma and Zachary about the property's purposeful creation had registered more deeply than I had realized, creating foundation for potential preservation of values I had feared might be entirely lost through Michael and Christine's reframing. Our breakfast conversation continued with revealing mixture of typical teenage concerns and surprising insights regarding the lake house's significance. Both Emma and Zachary expressed genuine appreciation for elements Christine had been systematically targeting for updating: the hand-built bookshelves containing 3 generations of summer reading, the growth chart carved into hidden doorframe, tracking family members' heights across decades, the distinctive roof lines designed to shed snow while maximizing natural light during Michigan's long winters. I overheard Mom telling her designer friend that the kitchen is hopelessly outdated, Emma mentioned as we cleaned breakfast dishes, using the efficient system my mother had established during the house's early years. But everything is exactly where it needs to be when you're actually cooking. Her modern kitchen at home looks amazing in photos but is super inefficient when you're making actual meals. This observation, prioritizing functional purpose over aesthetic impression, revealed value alignment with the property's original design philosophy that transcended generational differences or contemporary trends. Despite immersion in Christine's status-oriented worldview and Michael's increasingly market-focused perspective, their children had somehow absorbed essential understanding that the lake house embodied values beyond appearance or financial considerations. As morning progressed into afternoon, the property gradually emptied of external service providers and overnight guests, returning to family configuration that might have allowed more substantial conversation about issues raised by the deed's discovery. Christine, however, announced plans requiring her immediate return to Chicago, client emergency necessitating in-person consultation that apparently couldn't be managed remotely despite technological options that had facilitated her work throughout previous 2 weeks. "I've already packed the essentials," she explained during brief family gathering in great room that noticeably excluded specific reference to when she might return. "Michael and the kids can continue the vacation as planned. I'll try to rejoin you if the Henderson project allows, but their timeline has suddenly accelerated." The timing, immediate departure following discovery of legal ownership reality that significantly complicated her vision for the property's transformation, suggested strategic retreat for consultation rather than genuine professional emergency. Michael's expression combined resigned acceptance with subtle relief, suggesting temporary suspension of necessary but difficult conversations might actually be welcome development. My own reaction surprised me with its clarity and absence of negative emotion. Christine's departure represented neither victory nor defeat, but simply decompression that might allow more authentic reconnection with Michael and my grandchildren without pressure of performing for external audience or navigating carefully constructed social narratives. "We'll manage just fine," I assured her with genuine rather than passive-aggressive meaning. Family time at the lake house has always accommodated coming and going as circumstances require. Following Christine's departure, undertaken with efficiency, suggesting extensive preparation rather than sudden decision, noticeable shift occurred in the property's atmosphere. Without conscious discussion or formal acknowledgement, daily rhythms gradually reverted to patterns more aligned with traditional lake house summers than recent entertainment-centered approach. Michael, temporarily relieved of navigating competing expectations between wife and mother, visibly relaxed into more authentic engagement with both the property and his children. Instead of constant phone conversations about business matters or renovation plans, he spent afternoon helping Zachary learn basic sailing maneuvers in the restored wooden boat. Rather than discussing potential subdivision plans or development opportunities, he and Emma explored trails surrounding the property while identifying bird species using the field guide Robert had annotated with decades of personal observations. Deliberately maintained supportive but unobtrusive presence, neither pressing advantage created by Christine's absence nor surrendering essential message conveyed through the deed's revelation. The lake house itself, when allowed to function as originally intended without overlay of social performance or status demonstration, naturally facilitated the kind of authentic connection and meaningful interaction that had been its purpose from inception. Over subsequent days, Michael's relationship with the property showed subtle but significant evolution. He began noticing details that had become invisible through familiarity or overshadowed by renovation discussions. The way morning light created distinct patterns across the great room floor through carefully positioned windows, the acoustic, properties that allowed conversation from the kitchen to be comfortably heard, but not overwhelmed by lake sounds entering through screened porch. The ingenious storage systems built into seemingly decorative elements that had facilitated 3 generations of family gatherings without modern clutter. "Dad really thought of everything, didn't he?" he observed one evening as we sat on the deck watching sunset display that had been specifically framed by architectural design. "I've been in multi-million-dollar homes that don't function half as well as this place." Function was always central to his approach, I confirmed, recognizing opening for meaningful perspective sharing rather than confrontation. But not just practical function. He and your grandfather designed emotional and relational function into every element. How spaces bring people together, how views connect inhabitants to natural rhythms, how materials age with character that reveals rather than conceals their history. This framing, design serving values beyond mere utility or appearance, visibly resonated with Michael in a way that suggested reconnection to understanding he had absorbed during childhood and early adulthood, before professional immersion in financial metrics and Christine's status-oriented influence had gradually transformed his relationship with the lake house legacy. "Christine sees different potential here," he acknowledged after thoughtful silence, tone suggesting recognition of fundamental values conflict rather than merely different aesthetic preferences. She envisions showcase that would impress clients and colleagues while potentially increasing property value through strategic improvements. "Different visions reflect different values," I offered, avoiding direct criticism while naming essential disconnect that had been developing for years. "The question isn't whether contemporary kitchens are objectively better than what we have, or whether open floor plans create more impressive visual impact than the current design. The question is what purpose this place serves and whether proposed changes enhance or diminish that central purpose." This redirection from specific modifications to underlying purpose created space for more meaningful exchange than technical discussions about renovation details or ownership percentages had allowed. For first time since tensions had surfaced, conversation centered on why the lake house existed rather than who controlled its features, or how it might be optimized for contemporary preferences. "I think I've lost sight of that purpose over the years," Michael admitted with unexpected vulnerability that contrasted sharply with professional persona he had increasingly adopted in family interactions. "When you and Dad added my name to the deed, I understood it as responsibility more than ownership. Somewhere along the way, those concepts got reversed in my thinking." This acknowledgement, reflecting genuine recognition rather than strategic concession, represented first step toward potential realignment with values the property had been created to embody and transmit. Not complete transformation, certainly, but meaningful opening that might allow reconnection with legacy that had been increasingly obscured by different framing. "The deed was never the point," I reminded him gently, wanting to distinguish between legal formality and essential meaning. It simply documented shared understanding about continuity across generations. The property was never primarily financial, asset or status symbol, but physical embodiment of values your grandfather and father believed should guide not just how we vacation, but how we live. As evening deepened around us, our conversation explored dimensions of the lake house's purpose that transcended material considerations, how its creation had embodied values of patience, craftsmanship, and meaningful connection to both natural environment and family heritage. Michael shared memories from childhood summers that revealed deeper understanding of the property's significance than recent behaviors had suggested, while I offered perspectives about design intentions and philosophical foundations that illuminated aspects of the house he had experienced but perhaps not fully comprehended. This conversation, unfolding in the very spot where my father had first shared his vision for the property decades earlier, didn't resolve all tensions or immediately transform Michael's perspective. Complex reorientations require time and integration rather than sudden conversion. But it established foundation for potential reconnection with values that had been increasingly subordinated to different frameworks introduced through professional development and marital partnership. The following days brought continued evolution in family dynamics and relationship with the property. Without Christine's coordinating presence, activities emerged organically, rather than following predetermined schedule designed to maximize impression or entertainment value. Mornings might find different family members engaged in reading, fishing, maintenance projects, or simply observing wildlife from various vantage points specifically designed into the property's layout. Meals became collaborative rather than performative, drawing on family recipes and locally available ingredients instead of imported specialties or catered presentations. Michael's engagement with the property's maintenance revealed particularly telling shift in perspective. Rather than discussing contractor estimates or replacement options when minor issues emerged, he began addressing them personally using skills developed during childhood and adolescent participation in the house's ongoing care. When section of deck railing showed signs of weather damage, he spent afternoon carefully removing affected wood and crafting replacement spindles using techniques Robert had taught him decades earlier. "I'd forgotten how satisfying this feels," he acknowledged as I brought lemonade to his improvised workshop set up on the dock. "Creating something tangible that will last rather than just moving numbers around spreadsheets or optimizing investment strategies." This reconnection with the physical craftsmanship that had been central to the property's creation represented an important step toward reclaiming values that recent professional and social influences had increasingly obscured. Not rejection of his established identity or achievements, but reintegration of dimensions that had been progressively marginalized through different priorities and perspectives. Emma and Zachary responded to this shift with visible appreciation and engagement, joining projects that might previously have been outsourced to service providers or postponed pending renovation plans. Their natural affinity for the property's original purpose, evident even during the highly orchestrated celebration, flourished in atmosphere that prioritized meaningful engagement over impression management or status demonstration. "Could you teach me how to use great-grandpa's woodworking tools?" Zachary asked one afternoon, interest in craftsmanship skills suggesting transmission of values across generations despite intervening disruption. The ones in the workshop that you used when you were my age? This request, reaching across generational boundaries to connect with heritage that might otherwise have been lost through contemporary reframing, represented exactly the kind of continuity the property had been designed to facilitate. Not preservation of museum-like historical artifacts, but living transmission of skills and values that connected family members across time through shared understanding and purpose. As our extended time together continued without Christine's return, client emergency apparently expanding to require indefinite attention in Chicago, Michael gradually showed increasing comfort with the property's original identity and purpose. Conversations about renovation plans or development potential disappeared from daily interactions, replaced by genuine engagement with maintenance needs and preservation considerations that honored the house's intentional design and embodied Abrir Sansan. 6 weeks after the birthday celebration and deed revelation that had precipitated significant family recalibration, Michael received call from family attorney requesting meeting to discuss necessary updates to property documentation and potential trust arrangements for intergenerational asset protection. The formal language reflected professional legal perspective, but underlying purpose suggested recognition of need for more appropriate framework regarding the lake house's status and future management. "Would you be willing to join me for this meeting?" Michael asked, request reflecting both practical need, given shared ownership, and deeper recognition that decisions about the property should involve collaborative rather than unilateral consideration. "I think it's important that we address the legal realities together while ensuring the property's purpose remains central to any formal arrangements." This framing, prioritizing purpose over mere legal structure, suggested meaningful evolution in perspective that had been developing throughout our extended time together following Christine's departure. Not complete transformation of values or abandonment of contemporary concerns, but reintegration of foundational understanding that had been increasingly obscured by different frameworks introduced through professional development and marital partnership. The meeting itself, scheduled for September following our return to respective primary residences, would represent important formalization of shared understanding that had been emerging through lived experience rather than abstract discussion. The attorney's involvement offered opportunity to create legal structure aligned with the property's essential purpose, rather than merely documenting ownership percentages or control parameters. When time came for traditional end-of-summer departure from the lake house, the family gathering on the dock held markedly different energy than arrival had suggested might be possible. Where Christine's entrance had immediately established performance-oriented atmosphere focused on impression management and status demonstration, her extended absence had allowed natural emergence of the property's intended function as venue for authentic connection and meaningful engagement across generations. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding the difference between ownership and stewardship," Michael mentioned as we completed final preparations for departure. "I think that's distinction I lost sight of somewhere along the way. The deed listing my name alongside yours and Dad's wasn't primarily about legal control or financial asset, but recognition of responsibility to preserve something meaningful beyond market value or contemporary trends. This acknowledgement, reflecting genuine recognition rather than strategic positioning, suggested important realignment with values the property had been created to embody and transmit. Not rejection of his professional identity or abandonment of legitimate contemporary concerns, but reintegration of foundational understanding that provided essential context for any changes or future decisions. As we locked the lake house and prepared for return to our respective primary residences, I felt quiet confidence that essential purpose had been at least partially reclaimed through unexpected crisis that deed revelation had precipitated. The property's future remained uncertain in specific details. Christine's perspective and influence would certainly reassert upon family's reunion, and Michael's evolving understanding would face continued pressure from professional environment and social contexts prioritizing different values. But foundation had been established for more authentic engagement with legacy my father and husband had created. Physical embodiment of values designed to connect generations through shared understanding of what matters beyond financial success or social positioning. The deed's revelation had disrupted narrative that contradicted this purpose, creating necessary space for reconnection with essential meaning that might otherwise have been permanently obscured. 6 months later, I sat across from my son at our family attorney's office, tears in his eyes as he finally understood that some inheritances aren't measured in square footage, but in the memories woven into every floorboard and window pane. The trust document being formalized that day established legal structure aligned with the property's essential purpose, preserving family legacy designed for meaningful connection rather than financial optimization or status demonstration. Christine participated in this arrangement with pragmatic acceptance, if not wholehearted embrace of the property's original values. Her design ambitions had been channeled toward creating complementary guest cottage that would provide contemporary amenities. She valued without compromising historical integrity of main house that embodied different priorities and purposes. Not perfect alignment of perspectives, certainly, but workable accommodation that respected different values while preserving essential legacy. Most importantly, formal arrangements established clear parameters for intergenerational transmission that prioritized understanding and commitment to the property's purpose over mere legal inheritance or financial benefit. Emma and Zachary would eventually become stewards rather than simply owners, responsibility requiring demonstrated appreciation for values embedded in physical structure that transcended contemporary trends or market considerations. The lake house my father had envisioned, my husband had helped create, and I had helped build with my own hands over decades, would continue serving purpose for which it had been designed, connecting generations through physical embodiment of values that transcended changing trends, market fluctuations, or social positioning. The exclusion from family photo that had precipitated necessary boundary setting had ultimately led to deeper understanding of what truly constituted family legacy worth preserving. Some inheritances aren't measured in square footage or market valuation, but in the values embedded in every careful detail, every purposeful design element, every space created for meaningful connection rather than impression management. The deed had established legal reality, but the lasting resolution centered on rediscovering shared understanding of why the property existed and what purpose it was meant to serve across generations. Legacy more valuable than any vacation home, regardless of who appeared in the photographs documenting its story. 5 years have passed since the summer when a family photo and property deed transformed our family's understanding of legacy and ownership. The lake house stands much as it has for decades, its distinctive silhouette reflected in Lake Mitchell's waters, its craftsmanship aging with the dignified patina that only time and genuine materials can create. But while the physical structure remains fundamentally unchanged, the human relationships surrounding it have evolved in ways both subtle and profound. I visit the property now as honored elder rather than embattled defender, my role as steward of family values acknowledged, rather than minimized or dismissed. The trust arrangement formalized in the months following our confrontation established legal framework that aligned with the property's essential purpose, creating parameters for both current use and future transmission that prioritize understanding over mere inheritance. Today marks a special occasion, the 75th anniversary of my father's original purchase of the Lakeview Point property. 3 generations have gathered to commemorate this milestone with celebration that bears little resemblance to the elaborately orchestrated social event Christine arranged for my 70th birthday 5 years ago. Where that gathering emphasized impression management and status demonstration, today's commemoration centers on meaningful connection to the property's history and purpose. I arrived yesterday afternoon to find Michael already at work, preparing the property for family gathering. Not directing hired staff or coordinating professional services, but personally attending to maintenance tasks that connect him physically to the home his grandfather envisioned and his father helped create. The easy competence with which he replaced worn section of deck railing, using skills developed during childhood apprenticeship with Robert, suggested comfortable reconnection with craftsmanship values that had been temporarily obscured by different priorities. "I found Dad's original sketches for this section," he mentioned as I joined him, indicating weathered notebook on nearby table. His design accounts for water runoff patterns I wouldn't have considered. Explains why these railings have lasted decades while the neighbors need replacement every few years. This observation, appreciating purposeful design reflecting long-term thinking rather than merely aesthetic appearance, represented significant evolution from perspective that had characterized our conflict 5 years earlier. Not complete. Transformation certainly, but meaningful reintegration of values that had been progressively marginalized through professional immersion in financial metrics and social contexts, prioritizing different priorities. "Your father always designed from both practical knowledge and philosophical principles," I confirmed, grateful for opportunity to share context that deepened meaning rather than merely explain techniques. He would say that properly understood, they were never really separate considerations. As evening approached, Emma and Zachary arrived together from Ann Arbor, where she had recently begun architectural studies at the University of Michigan, and he was completing final year of high school while already taking college courses in environmental science. Their academic choices reflected influence of values embedded in the lake house experience, priorities shaped by understanding property as expression of principles rather than merely pleasant vacation venue. "We brought the albums we've been assembling," Emma announced as they unloaded carefully preserved collection from vehicle, otherwise filled with typical college student possessions. All the historical photos and documents organized by decade, with Zach's interviews transcribed, and my architectural analysis of how each modification reflected great-grandpa's original vision. This project, undertaken at their own initiative, rather than assigned requirement, represented exactly the kind of continuity the property had been designed to facilitate. Not passive inheritance of physical asset, but active engagement with values and principles the structure had been created to embody and transmit across generations. Christine and Michael arrived separately several hours later, their marriage having undergone significant recalibration following events precipitated by the deed revelation. Not dissolution, but meaningful renegotiation, establishing more balanced partnership that accommodated different perspectives without requiring surrender of essential values on either side. "The cottage renovations are finally complete," Christine announced after initial greetings. Characteristic focus on physical improvements reflecting priorities that remained consistent despite broader perspective evolution. The interior designer implemented concept that honors the main house aesthetic while incorporating contemporary elements. I think it successfully bridges different architectural periods. This framing, acknowledging continuity with historical, aesthetic rather than positioning updates as corrections to outdated elements, suggested important shift in how she conceptualized the property and its significance. Not complete embrace of preservation over innovation, but recognition that meaningful evolution builds upon rather than replaces foundational values and design principles. The guest cottage referenced represented physical manifestation of the compromise our family had negotiated during months following the confrontation. Located on previously undeveloped section of the property, the structure provided space for contemporary amenities and social functions Christine valued without compromising. Historical integrity of main house that embodied different priorities. Not perfect alignment of perspectives certainly, but workable accommodation that respected different values while preserving essential legacy. Most significantly, development had proceeded according to principles established in the trust arrangement, sustainable. Materials sourced with environmental consideration. Construction methods honoring traditional craftsmanship while incorporating appropriate modern techniques. Design elements reflecting purposeful relationship with natural landscape rather than imposing incompatible aesthetic. The result embodied compromise without surrender, innovation without erasure of essential values. As family gathered for dinner on the expansive deck where exclusion from photograph had triggered necessary boundary setting 5 years earlier, the atmosphere reflected evolved understanding that had emerged from that painful but ultimately constructive confrontation. Conversation flowed naturally between reflections on the property's history and discussion of its future, between appreciation for original craftsmanship and consideration of appropriate adaptations for changing family needs. Michael raised glass, in toast that captured this balanced perspective with unexpected eloquence. To 75 years of purpose beyond property, legacy beyond ownership, and values beyond valuation. May we continue being worthy stewards of what we've been entrusted to preserve and thoughtful creators of what we're privileged to develop. This sentiment, acknowledging both preservation responsibility and development opportunity within framework, prioritizing purpose over possession, reflected genuine integration of perspectives that had once seemed irreconcilably opposed. Not surrender of contemporary concerns or rejection of legitimate evolution, but thoughtful accommodation within parameters established by foundational values the property had been created to embody. After dinner, as twilight transformed the lake into mirror-reflecting both darkening sky and illuminated windows of the house my father had envisioned decades before construction began, Emma presented project that embodied this integration more concretely than abstract discussion could express. Using architectural skills developed through formal education and practical experience gained through participation in cottage construction, she had created proposal for sensitively designed family archive space to be incorporated within existing structure. The truest preservation isn't freezing something in time, she explained as family examined detailed plans reflecting both technical competence and philosophical understanding beyond her 21 years. It's ensuring that what matters most continues fulfilling its essential purpose while evolving to remain relevant and meaningful. Her design transformed underutilized storage area beneath library into dedicated space for preserving documents, photographs, tools, and artifacts that told property's ongoing story. Not museum-like exhibition, separate from living space, but integrated environment where family members could physically connect with historical materials while contributing contemporary additions to continuing narrative. I've consulted with preservation specialists about proper archival methods, she continued, professional attention to technical detail balanced with genuine appreciation for intangible significance. But the design prioritizes accessibility over institutional protocols. Family engagement with these materials matters more than perfect conservation standards. This approach, balancing professional best practices with family-centered purpose, reflected sophisticated understanding of what the lake house fundamentally represented. Not architectural showcase or historical monument, but living embodiment of values designed to connect generations through shared appreciation of what transcends changing trends or market considerations. The materials themselves matter less than the stories they contain and the values they represent, Zachary added, environmental science perspective complementing his sister's architectural focus. That's why we've been conducting interviews with everyone who has significant connection to the property, capturing memories and perspectives that physical artifacts alone can't preserve. Their collaborative project embodied exactly the kind of thoughtful stewardship the trust arrangement had been designed to encourage: engagement transcending mere ownership, responsibility exceeding legal obligation, purpose guiding decisions, beyond practical considerations or contemporary preferences. Not perfect recreation of original vision, but meaningful continuation that honored foundational principles while incorporating legitimate evolution. As discussion continued into evening, Christine contributed perspectives that would have seemed inconceivable during tension-filled interactions 5 years earlier. Not complete transformation of values or abandonment of aesthetic priorities. That defined her professional identity, but genuine recognition that the property's significance transcended categories she had previously applied. Working with the craftspeople who restored the original cabinetry changed my understanding of what quality actually means, she acknowledged. Professional designers' vocabulary applied to concepts previously dismissed as sentimental attachments. The joinery techniques Robert used create functional integrity that manufactured alternatives simply can't replicate, regardless of premium materials or fashionable finishes. This appreciation, recognizing value beyond appearance or novelty, reflected important evolution in perspective following confrontation that had initially appeared destructive rather than potentially constructive. Not surrender of professional expertise or contemporary awareness, but expanded understanding incorporating dimensions previously unrecognized or undervalued in her approach to environmental design. Michael's contribution to evening's reflective conversation revealed similarly expanded perspective that integrated rather than abandoned different frameworks. His financial expertise remained evident in discussions of property maintenance endowment and trust structure optimization, but these considerations now existed within broader understanding that transcended purely economic evaluation. The most valuable aspect of what Grandpa and Dad created can't be captured in appraisal or market analysis, he observed as family gathered around stone fireplace my father had constructed by hand over 3 years of weekend labor. I've come to understand that some forms of wealth don't appear on balance sheets, but create foundations that support everything else that matters. This perspective, acknowledging limitations of purely financial metrics when evaluating meaningful legacy, represented significant evolution from framework that had characterized his approach 5 years earlier. Not rejection of professional identity or legitimate practical considerations, but expanded understanding that contextualized these dimensions within more comprehensive appreciation of what constitutes genuine value. As evening progressed, family retired to various corners of the property according to individual preferences and established traditions. Zachary and Michael engaged in chess match using set Robert had carved during winter evenings of my childhood, their concentration mirroring intensity generations of family members had brought to same activities in same spaces. Emma settled into reading nook, positioned to capture both moonlight across the lake and warm glow from fireplace, architectural journal sharing space with my father's handwritten construction diaries, in physical representation of continuity across different eras. Christine, in development I might not have anticipated 5 years earlier, had established her own tradition connecting to property in manner aligned with her particular gifts and perspectives. The professional photographer now arrived for what had become annual documentation session. Not social media showcase or portfolio development, but thoughtful visual chronicle capturing property's evolution through changing seasons and human interventions. I've been studying historical architectural photography, she explained as she arranged equipment with characteristic precision. How to capture not just structural elements, but the relationship between built environment and natural setting, between permanent features and changing light conditions. This approach, applying professional expertise to meaningful documentation rather than status demonstration, reflected important evolution in her relationship with the property. Not abandonment of aesthetic appreciation or contemporary awareness, but redirection of these values toward purpose aligned with the lake house's fundamental significance rather than imposed identity contradicting its essential character. Watching. Family members engage with property in these diverse but harmonious ways. I recognize success more meaningful than legal victory or philosophical vindication could have provided. The lake house was fulfilling purpose for which it had been created, connecting generations through physical embodiment of values that transcended changing trends, market fluctuations, or social positioning. The conflict precipitated by excluded photograph and revealed deed had ultimately strengthened rather than damaged this essential function. The following morning brought perfect early summer conditions for ceremony commemorating 75th anniversary of property's initial purchase. Gathered at Lakeside beneath oak tree, my father had specifically preserved during initial construction. its massive trunk providing shade for 3 generations of family conversations, and its spreading branches framing view across water to distant shoreline, extended family and selected community members with historical connection to property's development shared reflections that collectively illuminated its continuing significance. Michael had arranged for town's historical society representative to present official recognition of the property's architectural and cultural importance, acknowledgement of values that transcended family significance to embody regional heritage worth preserving. Emma and Zachary unveiled architectural model representing property's evolution across decades, physical representation of how purposeful design accommodates change while maintaining essential character and function. Most meaningful contribution came from Christine, whose evolution over 5 years since confrontation had perhaps been most significant, precisely because it required greatest recalibration of established values and perspectives. The professional photo collection she presented, leather-bound volume documenting property through seasonal changes and architectural details often overlooked by casual observation, represented not mere visual record but thoughtful engagement, with meaning embedded in physical structure. "I've tried to capture what Margaret once described as values made visible," she explained, as family examined images revealing craftsmanship details and design elements previously underappreciated. In her renovation-focused perspective, how principles like patience, connection to natural environment, and intergenerational thinking can be expressed through architectural choices that might otherwise seem merely stylistic or outdated. This framing, recognizing purposeful philosophy behind physical features previously judged primarily by contemporary aesthetic standards, reflected genuine evolution in how she understood the property and its significance. Not complete alignment with original vision, certainly, but meaningful recognition that transcended utilitarian evaluation or status considerations that had previously dominated her approach. When time came for commemorative photograph documenting this milestone gathering, the contrast with excluded image that had precipitated necessary boundary setting 5 years earlier could not have been more pronounced. Rather than choreographed arrangement emphasizing controlled appearance and social presentation, this image captured extended family in authentic engagement with property that had shaped 4 generations of shared experience and values transmission. Most significantly, composition included everyone connected to property's ongoing story: myself as eldest representative of original vision, Michael and Christine as current co-stewards navigating different but increasingly integrated perspectives, Emma and Zachary as future trustees, already demonstrating thoughtful engagement with responsibilities that transcended mere inheritance. Even community members who had contributed to property's development or preservation appeared at edges of frame, acknowledging that meaningful legacy extends beyond strictly defined family boundaries to include broader connections shaped by shared values and purpose. Unlike staged image that had excluded me from family's visual narrative 5 years earlier, this photograph captured authentic moment rather than managed impression, relationships as they actually existed rather than curated. Presentation designed to project specific image for external consumption. The difference embodied exactly the distinction between property as stage for status performance and home as venue for meaningful connection that had undergirded our conflict from its beginning. As summer visit extended beyond anniversary celebration into traditional weeks of family engagement with the property, I observed with quiet satisfaction how the trust arrangement formalized following our confrontation had facilitated exactly the kind of balanced evolution the lake house had been, designed to accommodate. Not rigid preservation, preventing legitimate adaptation to changing family needs, but thoughtful stewardship ensuring that modifications enhanced rather than diminished essential purpose and character. The guest cottage Christine had championed provided space for contemporary social functions and amenities without compromising historical integrity of main house. The archive space Emma had designed created dedicated environment for preserving historical materials, while encouraging active engagement with ongoing documentation. Michael's financial expertise had established endowment ensuring properties maintenance regardless of economic fluctuations or individual capacity, while Zachary's environmental focus had informed sustainable practices preserving natural setting that had inspired original purchase. Most importantly, decision-making process established through trust parameters ensured that all perspectives received appropriate consideration within framework, prioritizing property's fundamental purpose over individual preferences or contemporary trends. Not perfect consensus, certainly. Different family members continued bringing different values and priorities to specific questions, but structured approach that balanced innovation with preservation, contemporary needs with historical integrity. I never thought I'd say this, Christine acknowledged during conversation on dock where confrontation had unfolded 5 years earlier. But the limitations this place imposes actually enhance its value rather than restrict its potential. Working within parameters established by Robert's design has made the cottage project more meaningful than unlimited options would have provided. This recognition, that constraints can enhance rather than diminish creative significance, represented philosophical evolution transcending specific architectural preferences or design approaches, not surrender of aesthetic expertise or contemporary awareness, but expanded understanding of how meaningful innovation builds upon rather than simply replaces established foundations. Michael's perspective demonstrated similar integration of previously competing frameworks, professional financial expertise now contextualizing rather than dominating his relationship with the property and its significance. I've applied lessons learned here to my investment approach more broadly, he explained during conversation about trust management strategies. The difference between transactions that extract maximum short-term value and relationships that develop sustainable long-term value. Dad and Grandpa understood that distinction intuitively, but I had to relearn it through experience. This application, extending principles embedded in the lake house beyond property itself to broader professional approach, suggested transmission of values had occurred despite temporary disruption or competing influences. Not rejection of legitimate financial considerations, but integration within more comprehensive framework, prioritizing relationships over transactions, sustainability over immediate returns. Emma and Zachary, representing generation that would eventually assume primary stewardship responsibilities, demonstrated understanding that combined appreciation for historical foundations with recognition of legitimate evolution. Their ongoing documentation project, combining architectural analysis, oral history collection, environmental impact assessment, and cultural context research, created foundation for future decisions grounded in comprehensive understanding rather than merely personal preference or contemporary trends. The trust parameters about demonstrated understanding initially seemed abstract, Emma reflected during discussion about eventual inheritance requirements established following our confrontation. But working with the archival materials and interviewing family members has transformed that concept from legal obligation into meaningful engagement with why this place matters beyond its financial value. This perspective, valuing understanding as prerequisite for responsible stewardship, rather than merely procedural requirement, embodied exactly the principle the trust arrangement had been designed to establish. Not arbitrary hurdle preventing legitimate inheritance, but necessary foundation, ensuring that physical property remained connected to values and purpose that justified its preservation across generations. As my extended visit concluded, and younger, family members continued summer traditions I had experienced since childhood, I departed with confidence that essential transmission had occurred despite, or perhaps because of, crisis that deed revelation and excluded photograph had precipitated 5 years earlier. The lake house my father had envisioned, my husband had helped create, and I had helped build with my own hands over decades would continue serving purpose for which it had been designed, connecting generations through physical embodiment of values that transcended changing trends, market fluctuations, or social positioning. The trust arrangement formalized following our confrontation had established legal structure aligned with this essential purpose, preserving family legacy designed for meaningful connection rather than financial optimization or status demonstration. But the true resolution existed not in documents or parameters, but in genuinely evolved understanding demonstrated through actions and approaches revealing values integration rather than merely strategic accommodation. Michael now approached the property as steward rather than owner, responsibility guiding decisions about maintenance and modification, with understanding transcending legal authority or financial considerations. Christine had found ways to apply professional expertise and aesthetic sensitivity that enhanced rather than diminished the property's essential character, contributing contemporary perspective without requiring historical erasure. Emma and Zachary were developing capacities that would eventually enable thoughtful evolution, preserving fundamental purpose while accommodating legitimate adaptation to changing family needs and cultural contexts. Most importantly, the property itself continued fulfilling function for which it had been created. Physical embodiment of values designed to connect generations through shared experience and understanding that transcended individual preferences or temporal circumstances. The house my father had envisioned while studying sunset patterns across undeveloped lakefront remained living expression of principles that guided its creation, rather than merely pleasant vacation venue or potential investment opportunity. The family photo that now documented milestone anniversary captured what the excluded image 5 years earlier had deliberately omitted: authentic connection to legacy that transcended photogenic appearance or social presentation. The deed that had revealed legal reality had ultimately facilitated deeper understanding of what constituted the property's true value beyond ownership percentages or market valuation. Standing on the dock one final time before departure, watching sunlight illuminate the house that had shaped 4 generations of family experience and values transmission, I recognized that the painful confrontation precipitated by excluded photograph and revealed deed had ultimately strengthened rather than damaged this essential function. The boundary established through necessary assertion of legal reality had created space for reconnection with purpose that might otherwise have been permanently obscured by different frameworks introduced through professional development, social, positioning, or contemporary trends. Some inheritances aren't measured in square footage or market valuation, but in the values embedded in every careful detail, every purposeful design element, every space created for meaningful connection rather than impression management. The deed had established legal reality, but the lasting resolutions centered on rediscovered understanding of why the property existed and what purpose it was meant to serve across generations. Legacy more valuable than any vacation home, regardless of who appeared in the photographs documenting its continuing story.